All right, so once again, my name is Julian Dierkes. I'll be your host for this conversation about the Mongolian presidential election. I teach at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Enkhtsetseg, would you introduce yourself?
So short name is Inhi, actually. It's on the screen. I work for Open Society Forum based in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. Open Society Forum works with the domestic election monitoring organization, including election observers on election day. Very short.
Excellent, perfect. Jana, how about you?
Good morning, everyone, or good evening to Canada. My name is Jana. I am head of mission of Caritas Czech Republic, and during the presidential elections, I volunteered to be an international observer.
So jealous. 6 times I've done that, and now I've been 2 years in a row not been able to go to Mongolia. Looking forward to hearing about that, Jana. Anand, who are you? A camel herder, but other than that, what do you do? What's your day job when you don't herd camels?
My day job is a freelance journalist, so I mainly write for foreign publications. I write for Reuters and for BNE and Telenews. It's a emerging markets news outlet, and I've written for ProPublica and Foreign Policy and all that. And I've extensively covered the presidential election this year, so that was quite exciting.
And thank you for that, Anna. That's great. Marissa, are you a shepherd?
Oh, no, I took this picture doing archaeology, actually.
But that's not your day job either.
No, not exactly. Yeah. So I'm Marissa Smith. I'm an anthropologist. I'm currently affiliated with the Institute for East Asian Studies at UC Berkeley, and I collaborate with Julian and Bulgan and others on Mongolia focus.
We do indeed. Bulgan, what do you do other than collaborate?
I am studying and trying to understand the complexities of the world. So I study at University of British Columbia. I'm a PhD student at the Institute of Resource Environment and Sustainability. And of course, I'm always very keen and eager on Mongolia related stuff, if it's politics or democracy or mining.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Julian.
Good. Thanks, Bulgan. Enki, do you want to start us off? Tell us, what do the domestic observers do as opposed to the international observers? And how did this election look to you?
Well, domestic observers obviously have the advantage of, actually living in this country. So there's no distinction like short-term, long-term observers. So we're here for the long term. We've been doing this since 2004, as far as I remember. Even before that, actually, if you hear from organizations like Global International and Voter Education Center, obviously they've been around before I joined OSF. I joined OSF in 2006, and since then I've been working on elections. So 2008 was my first election, which was also the most tragic and eventful election in Mongolia's democratic history, as you all remember probably. So this year, what we did was, what happens is, like, before the election, all the election monitoring NGOs and organizations meet and discuss and agree on what we will focus on during elections, because election is a complex, huge event, and there are many aspects to it. So this year we did voter list monitoring. We also didn't want to leave out the automatic ballot scanning technology as well, because there is not much trust in the technology when it comes to electoral technology in Mongolia. Probably Julian also remembered this from past elections. There's always something about the black machine, so-called the black machine. A video or two, which actually also happened during this election. There was a video recording of a supposed whistleblower talking about selling the technology and rigging the electoral outcomes using this technology, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why it's important to have independent monitors also working with the GEC and doing monitoring during the preparation process, especially. So we did that, and we also covered the media, TV coverage of elections, and also to some extent social media as well, because social media is, fast becoming a very popular platform for candidates to use for their campaign messages, etc. So we did that on Facebook. The organization is called Center for Investigative Journalists. They do also fact checking as well, which they also did during this election as well. They were actually prepared to fact check during a presidential debate, which didn't unfortunately happen. So, and of course, on the election day, we deploy our observers, usually young people, very young people, a lot of first-time voters as well, because we want this to be an opportunity for them to learn about the election and also kind of serve as a voter education platform for them. And this year, we covered more than 50 polling stations, 48 in Ulaanbaatar and others in 4 different provinces. So what happens in Mongolia is like on the election, there's not much happening. It's a very much peaceful process. It's just that, the whole purpose is for us to be there to kind of distinguish between administrative errors that can be translated as like huge vote rigging manipulation by those, who have different motives. So, so the whole reason why we have our people there is just to give like really objective information on what happened during the day, what kind of errors we observed and how they were fixed, etc. And yesterday we held our press briefing, which was actually broadcast live on NewsMN and other internet-based news sites and a few of the TV channels. Because of the COVID, we couldn't actually invite a lot of people to brief us. Usually it's a huge packed event in our conference room. Yesterday it was sparsely attended, but nevertheless well covered, which is why I couldn't actually check all the messages you guys were sending, because I've been doing rounds of interviews with TV yesterday. So very briefly, this is from me, and if you want to ask specific questions about the results, findings, etc., I'll be happy to answer.
Terrific, thank you. Jana, first time as an international election observer, first country to do so. How did you find it and what did you see?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Julian. First time, hopefully not the last time. I spoke to my friends who worked as international observers, either in Mongolia before or in other countries, and I have to say that my experience it's very different. But I would say that it's especially due to the COVID-19 situation. First of all, I was super excited about getting this opportunity. It was a very transparent and open process. We contacted General Election Committee, but they also actually contacted us because we have a project that works with young people, and we had some social media campaigns to encourage them to vote. And we started it last year with the parliamentary elections, and we continue with local elections in fall 2020, and now with the presidential elections. So basically, and they ask us to appoint observers, both local and international. So it was a great opportunity for me to step in and to have some fun during these COVID-19 times. Actually, just yesterday, I read that there were 83 international observers. Honestly, I have not met, or I do not know about any other international observers. The whole process of communication with the General Election Committee and with other entities was not as smooth as I would expect. In terms of we had the first meeting. I think it was like more than a month ago. And then all other meetings, we were informed about them a couple of hours before they actually happened. So for me personally, it was almost impossible to attend them because I could not simply reschedule all other appointments and all other meetings. So at some point, it was approximately 2 weeks before the elections, I was a little bit upset and frustrated about the process, and I wanted to step down because I really wanted to be involved as much as possible to understand the process, to see whether everything is transparent, whether everything is according to the law. But I simply could not. I could not attend the meetings that were announced a couple of hours before they actually happened. We had some discussion with the election committee, and we decided to simply just continue. I was very happy to observe the election during the election days 3 days ago. Of course, due to the COVID-19 situation, also my colleague who was supposed to join me and help me with some with the translation and stuff, she got sick, so I had to ask my family members to come with me to polling stations and to help me with the translation. My experience during day D, during the presidential elections, was, however, very positive. I was really impressed by the way the polling stations were prepared, and different COVID-19 restrictions and policies were in place. Everybody followed it. It was really peaceful. It was a very nice process to observe. And I do not have, honestly, many negative points to write in my report, because as an international observer, I did not really see any big discrepancies or any mistakes being made during the presidential election. So in overall, for me, it was a very nice process, many lessons learned, and I really hope that it is not the last time that I had a chance to be an international observer.
Excellent, Jana. Did you stay in one polling station or did you move around?
I moved around. I wanted to check more of them, so I visited 3 of them.
Okay. And here, when the domestic observers typically stay in one station, right? You pick one and then stay there all day for the most part. Is that right? Oh, maybe we've lost her. Oh, now here she is.
See, we assign like 2 observers per polling station. So we change shifts in the middle of the day, so they don't get exhausted.
Right, but
Yeah,
they don't move around from station to station. So
yes,
it's
until the very end.
Right.
Of the
And were you able to observe the counting this time? Jana or Enkje, generally, was counting observable this time?
For me, it was not possible.
Okay.
If we observe every aspect of the day, so nothing is left out. We have a very detailed checklist.
Yeah, excellent. Anand, less formally, you were
Yes.
probably roving around.
Yes.
You probably talked to lots of people. You saw lots of things. We're curious to hear, how did the day go?
So I started my reporting way before the elections even started. I think I started on Saturday, and I just went around the city, try to get sense of what the voter base was thinking and who are they leaning towards. And most of the time, people did not want to speak with me or say, and even, but I'm very persistent, so I usually say like, who are you voting? And then when they don't answer, like, what do you want to see to change in this country? And I just keep on persisting. And usually when I spoke with voters, I had a sense that most of them were very happy with the current state of the system in Mongolia, and COVID seems to be a non-issue for them. And I talked about that, and I even asked about what they think about Mongolia becoming a dictatorship championed by the Democratic Party, and none of the voters that I spoke with said that it's not a thing. It's not going to happen. Even people who supported Enkhtsetseg told me this today. They said like that that's not going to happen. We're just going to move on and just we are a democratic country and this is the 21st century, and that rhetoric did not seem to resonate with any of the voters. And basically the general air of the election was that almost like majority of the young voters leans towards the new party candidate, Enkhtsetseg, and the older ones lean towards Hurusuk. And I've yet to find a voter who actually voted for the Democratic Party. But I had even though to me it was a big base. I think I've talked with like almost 50 people within that range. I never met a person who said they supported even the Democratic Party candidate, and it was quite interesting to look to think about, because I think in prior elections you would see people that they would say that I support the Democratic candidate. You would see that contrast, and also I think in this election I could not really venture outside of the Ulaanbaatar. I went to a nearby Som in the Tuv province, and I spoke with some of the voters there. But aside from that, I cannot assess anything from the other regions and other provinces of Mongolia. But yeah, I think and if you have any questions about I was also involved with actually with the Mongolian Center for Investigative Reporters. I worked with the other local newsrooms to fact check the candidates during the debate, which did not happen, as Enkhtsetseg mentioned. But we did have a chance to kind of fact check the candidates. I was at the few rallies of the candidates, and I took rigorous notes of what the candidates had to say. And the biggest person who kind of told like misinformation was the main candidate who won. But I think that comes with a grain of salt, because his government was in power most of the time, so he has a lot of things to talk about, the things he can take into, and yeah, and overall the election was very smooth. And the last thing I would like to mention was that I talked with two candidates in this election. I could not access the main candidate at all. I think that was one of the frustrating things in this election, that I could not get access, and other journalists in Mongolia, local journalists, could not even have access to the winner of this election. He was very inaccessible to media, besides outside of the Mongolian national broadcaster and some media outlets that was maybe affiliated with him. So aside from that, I think this was a good and smooth election. Yeah. And if you have any questions, I'm free to answer them.
That's great, Anand. We've got questions coming into the chat already, and we'll store those up for the Q&A in the end. Just some quick ones, though, that maybe to deal with right now. Jana is asking us whether you talk to white voters, to blank ballot voters, and how did they explain their choice if you did talk to them?
Yes, so I haven't met too much of those. I've only met like 3 of them, and one of them said that he was very uncomfortable speaking about it, that he wants to see some change. He was leaning towards Hurusuk, but he doesn't trust the person as much, that he seems like a very dishonest person, and he does not see Enkhtsetseg as a viable candidate. And he did not. He saw that he was more of a token, and he said like it's just no purpose. And he told me that he would maybe vote for Enkhtsetseg if the elections, if they go to a runoff. So that was his thinking of of casting the blank ballots to see a runoff. Other blank ballots that I spoke with seem to be leaning towards the Democratic Party. They really remarked on how the Democratic Party did something for the country, and the ruling party was trying to smear that and to make them think that they did all the work. But they didn't. I think they didn't like the candidate that was representing the party, and I think that was their choices of not voting for Irten. Yeah.
And what about the typical arguments to vote for Hurst or for the MPP? What were the reference points? Voters mostly talk about him as a candidate, or about the party or party successes or proposed policies. Were there any themes to that, Anand?
So the main themes that people really talked about is that they will have finally a government that has very little discourse. I think they were tired of a lot of the bickering, the political squabble that happens between the two parties, and a lot of the voters told me that they will have a party that is a government that is consistent, that will not have any kind of issues with inside. Things will move smoothly. And other voters talked about how Hurst did so much for the country, and also of the government giving a lot of social benefits to the people. And I think also the people were very keen on seeing more, I think, social benefits that come out from this new presidency. One voter told me that she really wants to see her pension go up. I think we're around the lowest, I think, is around 300,000 Turks. So that's almost roughly $100 per month. So that's not a lot of money for a lot of old folks. And I think those kind of things people wanted to see. Like, they really want to see some quick progress in this new president, a lot of quick changes, a lot of swift benefits to the people. Yeah.
Interesting. We're a pretty small group, so I would suggest we keep going for a moment, and then we'll open up to just a wider discussion that we can let flow a bit more, including a lot of the topics that are coming up in the chat already. Marissa, any particular themes or observations you want to pick up on?
Yeah, I guess the only thing maybe I wanted to say that maybe hasn't already been mentioned, or might not be mentioned, is I actually read all the platforms yesterday. And I was actually very surprised that the Democratic Party platform actually has some substantial policy points and, specific suggestions that I didn't really see a lot of that in the other platforms. So I'm not sure what to make of that. I think it may indicate that, there was maybe wider input into that document. I'm interested to kind of compare it with the parliamentary platform again, which I haven't gotten around to doing yet, but yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I'm in the camp that I think the DP is something of it seems to be viable, and that was one of the things that's indicating to me it is. I would also just kind of point to Batulga did kind of go away and give out these awards, and Batulga still, is a business person of means. So, I don't know. And Bulgan just pointed out in the chat that Babur came out and is supporting the DP. So, also maybe people didn't notice Elbigdorj, made statements supporting Erdogan as a candidate. So, all of those things I think we should take into consideration of, what's the future. Just because people didn't want to vote for DP or Erdogan right now, there's those things as well. So. The other thing about the vote counting is I noticed a few places saying that the votes were all counted by hand. So I'm curious to learn more about why this hand counting, or what's the deal with that?
Oh, I bet Enki can speak to that in a moment if you want. Marissa, on the DP platform, one of the things that I found so confusing about that was they're primarily legislative proposals. Now, obviously, the president has the right to introduce legislation, but his legislation would have had a snowball's chance in hell to go anywhere. And so to approach voters and say, if you vote for me, I will introduce this legislation, borders on the silly, because none of it would have been enacted, right? But what, so, and I said, Anand, you're unmuting, is that,
Yeah.
do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, the few voters I spoke to, I think they have a sense that the presidency, our presidency, is very similar to the American presidency, that they have a lot of range of power, and they don't see, they have not fully taken into the fact that the constitutional amendments have stripped away those most of the powers, and I think that that's why maybe Irton was leaning towards that. Maybe people will resonate that I'm going to do some kind of change, because people think that the president actually does pass laws when in fact he doesn't. He just proposes them, and yeah, maybe because of that he was leaning towards it. I think he was, in my mind, I don't know what was his thinking, or what was his party's thinking, but I think that might have played a role, because most of the voters I've spoken with, that they saw the president as a person who would do a lot of things, that he would be in charge of a lot of things, and who basically controls the government in a sense, in a big tent.
Is that the sense you got from the platform, Marissa, that this was sort of maybe a pretense at decisive action, even though
they're all pretty symbolic. I mean, they're all
Yeah.
pretty symbolic and pretty out there. I mean, the MPP platforms are like, we're going to build 10 power stations and we're going to export energy to Southeast Asia. I mean, so they're pretty, you know, I don't know that I would read them necessarily as plans that are based in immediate reality. Although my understanding is that under Mongolian law, like, you can be held to account for making campaign promises that are out there. So that's also interesting.
So in some ways, 10 power stations is about as likely to happen as legislation proposed by the DP in Parliament, roughly comparable.
Yeah.
Roughly, hey. Anything else on the two other platforms that you noticed as you were reading them, Marissa?
Well, Enkhtsetseg is interesting because it was very muted. I mean, so where Erdogan had this legislative stuff that I also noticed because it was on Instagram, and I think it was one of the only things for his platform on Instagram. So there was, again, if you want to get into interesting social media, in the same place at the end of his platform, Enkhtsetseg had this, like, I want to have policy councils that advise, it wasn't really clear whom. I guess now that I say that, I think that there have been obviously precursors to that, and like kind of having advisors is certainly something that is common in Mongolian politics. But yeah, Enktsetseg's platform was quite vague, and so that was a little surprising to me, and it was much shorter than the other two. I think it was like half as long.
Right, and MPP, you said, sort of grand gestures, a lot of symbolism.
Yeah, and it was closely aligned with, Vision 2050. There were a couple of specific things, though, that it was like, okay, they actually looked in and made some changes. So for instance, there was actually talk about bringing back military programs for students. And there was actually a note that was like, women's participation will be voluntary, which kind of was like, okay, this may be referencing that gaffe of Oyun Erdogan's in March. So yeah, it's interesting. They don't just come across to me as like copy paste either. They're worth taking a look at.
Excellent, thank you. Jana, you want to jump in on this topic?
Maybe a little bit different topic. I just wanted to answer Marissa's comment on counting the votes by hand. So in general, the situation before the elections, or the atmosphere before the elections, voters, especially young people, they did not really believe that if the votes are only counted electronically, that it will be transparent, that it will be simply correct. So maybe Enke can jump in and correct me, but I think in this way, because it was kind of double counting the votes. So in this way, they wanted to make sure that the votes are counting correctly, and there is a transparent way in place.
Antti, you want to talk about the manual recount? It was a portion last time, and it was everything this time, right?
So it's always been in the law that the manual recount will be done in up to 50% of all polling stations, and all polling stations are randomly selected at the end of the polling on election day. So that was the law before, but even with that law in place, there was not much trust in the technology. Obviously, if you remember last year, the day after the election, there was a huge, sensational news about how GEC probably has rigged the electoral outcome, et cetera, although it was just a preliminary result. There was an error in transmitting the data onto the screen, right? That's why this year the law was changed, and now manual counting is conducted in all polling stations. It's just a reflection of distrust in the technology. But ironically, there is no, you can't actually find any discrepancy between the manually counted tally and also the electronically counted tally. So hopefully after this year, people will have more trust in the technology, because technology is actually quite basic technology, and we've been trying to explain the workings of it to political parties, etc. But I guess not everyone is quick to grasp this kind of things, right? Maybe that's also part of this overall distrust in the technology. But that's just briefly what this is all about.
It's funny that you mentioned that there were no discrepancies. I mean, that's what happened last time too, right? All the manual recounts confirmed all the electronic counts, which is as you would expect. But nevertheless, trust does not always result from more pieces of evidence of appropriate counting, and mistrust is obviously placed in institutions in this case, and all the technology applied does not necessarily solve that issue. Bulgan, topics that you want to pick up on?
So the foreign voters, maybe. So the voter turnout in the foreign votes, it's almost opposite to the votes in Mongolia, right? The results are very different. But for example, we have about over 70% voting for Enkhtsetseg, but on the other hand, supporting only about a few percent that supports 20% supporting, and it's exactly the opposite than in country. So that's very interesting, I thought. And definitely, it's very hard to vote if you're living abroad, and on the presidential election, we can go vote. And I was not able to vote because it's just very far and very costly for me. I do participated in all the elections in Mongolia, except last year, parliamentary election, and I've been able to join the elections as the observers. So this year, it wasn't, but I get to vote, I get to support a candidate, and then I get to do first time ever political donation. So I think that's a very cool experience too. Yeah.
What do you think, Bulgan? Why were the few Mongolian voters abroad who had a chance to vote? I mean, like you said, we're in Vancouver. We weren't even allowed to travel to Ottawa, so you couldn't have voted really if you wanted to, right? But why is the majority did the majority so overwhelmingly vote for Enkhtsetseg? What is it that attracts particularly Mongolians abroad to his cause?
There's always this debate, Julian, that we have MPP have a strong party loyals in Mongolia, and those are usually considered like seniors and older generation of people, and they have their systems in place that they do like take care of those people. They have the meetings, they call them into horo and give them gifts, they invite them for teas, and there's all these things going on. And then they also get gifts, gift as like maybe like a package of tea or something nice. And then so definitely elders like are their strong base support. And there's always this conversation that we're gonna see a change in the politics with the generational change. In other words, we are waiting the elders to die out or something. The thing, I'm not sure if that's really, really like the younger, maybe relatively younger voters in the abroad that are changing, that really had a different perspective. So definitely there's that. And people are saying that educated Mongolians, and I don't believe that educated Mongolians were voting for Inkpat. And I kind of get a bit offended and annoyed by that framing. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a couple issues in there that maybe I'll follow up with and that have come up in the chat already as well. And to lead into that, the first is voter participation and turnout. And a shout out to Toby, who's here today, who did for those of us who were based abroad, that wonderful voter per hourly update from the GEC was not available internationally, and so screenshots helped a lot. Robert Ritz posted some screenshots and Toby kept us up to date too, which was really helpful. But just a quick glance, I mean, the overall turnout rate at just, Bulgan posted this earlier, it was just under 60%, significantly lower than the first round in 2017, about the same as the second round. Now, there's obviously a COVID context to that, both in terms of people on the day voting, but I think one of the things that a number of people have pointed out already, the ongoing challenges with registration, which is that migrants are unable to re-register in Ulaanbaatar, in part because of that ban on re-registration for presumably air pollution purposes. But particularly depressed the turnout this year, one would think, because no one would have traveled to the countryside to vote if they're actually based in Ulaanbaatar. Very few people would have. And so that's probably a little bit of what's going on there as well. So I think it's important to just think about some of the more details in the voter turnout, and that that icon has the very nice graphic version, but we're getting increasingly good numbers from the GEC from election to election as well. And one of the things that I would point to a little bit is that yesterday we saw a fair bit, and most of this is for me is on Twitter more than elsewhere, but a fair bit of discussion about the lack of young voters. What's misleading about that, though, is that in proportion, young voters don't vote much, but there's so many of them that they actually hold the dominant power in the election, right? Because those over 70s who vote in a very high proportion, there was only 65,000 voters over 70 out of the total of 1.2 million. And so in terms of actually swaying a result, they may be very active voters, but they don't do much for the result. Whereas if you look at the bottom age of the bracket, the under 30s, right, lumping the 18 and 19-year-olds and the 20 to 29 years old together, which the GEC breaks up, but lumping them together, the under 30s are 250,000 people. And so that's roughly a sixth of the votes that were cast. So while their participation rates are low, the total numbers are still quite large. And so young people do have a significant voice. Now, obviously, if the rates were higher, their voice would be even greater. And that's not to dismiss the question around young voters. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in motivating people to work. But just to say that, you know, sometimes it's about proportions and absolute numbers that makes a fair bit of difference. The other point I would notice that we've seen in all elections is, of course, the differential between women and men. So women voted, 62.8% of women voted, and only 55% of men did. And so of the total number of votes cast, of that 1.2 million, 55% are women. So we have and that's, you know, 55 is obviously because we've got parity in numbers, roughly, pretty close anyway. But so this is moving pretty far, right? This is a significant departure from just an even division between men and women. And so women are voting in significant numbers once again. Now, a couple of other sort of party dynamics I wanted to pick up on. Yeah, Marissa, it was 55-62, but of the total number of votes then, right? Those are the rates within the gender, but then of the total votes cast, that's how it ends up, if that makes sense, right? I did want to talk a little bit to some of the strengths and pick up on what Bulgan had just said. There was this, a lot of people were talking about how, you know, Enkhtsetseg wasn't able to break out of that bubble of the highly educated in Ulaanbaatar and really our Twitter bubble, because as it turns out, most people that I am in contact with on Twitter and elsewhere were Enkhtsetseg supporters in the end, but that's my weird selection of people that I know, right? They're largely academics, many of them foreign trained, many of them officials of some kind, and so they're prone to Enkhtsetseg. But to just simply note, if we look at some of the votes that Enkhtsetseg gathered in the city, now mind you, this is in the city, right? He got a third of the voters in places like Hanoi or a populous district like Bayangol. Now that's a lot of people. I don't think anyone would claim that a third of Bayangol voters, or never mind residents, are foreign educated intellectuals. There's lots of intellectuals who live in Bayangol. Some of them may be foreign educated, but not a third of the residents or the voters. And so I think it's important to note that in just the total numbers, Enkhtsetseg did break out of those bubbles, and there were lots of other people who supported him. And I just give that example, really all the central urban districts, the populous ones, you know, Baganu and all the outlying satellite Ulaanbaatar districts always vote weirdly and have very few voters, so they don't matter all that much in the counts. But the central Ulaanbaatar districts did come out with some significant support for Enkhtsetseg, which is important to note. But the other piece is the story about Enkhtsetseg was that many people were telling, at least, is no support in the countryside. Also turns out not to be true, right? He beat Erden in every single IMAG but two. So it's only Ahangay and Bayanurgi where Erden came ahead of Enkhtsetseg. And in almost all the other IMAGs, Enkhtsetseg's vote total is more than the blank ballot plus Erden. And so this is not just disaffected DP voters who voted blank and the DP would have won. These are all votes that Enkhtsetseg collected as a candidate. And so he did, I would say, yeah, he didn't get elected, but he certainly also did get a lot of people supporting him in the countryside, even though at the end, the numbers weren't strong enough. Now, just a quick note on some of the other strengths, maybe let's look at Hohenzog real quick, or maybe one more piece on Enkhtsetseg, because someone just posted Machnam voters voting Hohenzog, Bulgan just posted, but note that Enkhtsetseg's vote were not so strong in the Gobi, for example, in the Gobi provinces, where Gambatar last time in the first round was very strong, right? Gambatar's strongest vote totals in the round one in 2017 came in the Gobi provinces, and Enkhtsetseg did not do particularly well. I mean, a couple, they vary a bit more. He did okay in some of them, but that was, and presumably 2017, that Gambatar vote was largely a sort of a protest vote. And so that sort of, not quite knee-jerk, but that somewhat obstinate protest vote, perhaps, that went to Gambatar, did not go to Enkhtsetseg in the same way. Hohenzog, big strengths in some places you sort of expect in a way. So Henty, he had 82.5% in Henty as his home province, not so surprising. Although note that Henty voted for Batulak in 2017, right? Zilkova, 87% for Hohenzog. Now this is, you've just got to sort of think about that for a moment, right? In an election that we've heard in terms of, some of its administration, we've heard from both from Enke and from Jana, that in terms of just the running of an election, lots of things went quite right. And so for anyone to get 87.2% of a vote is pretty impressive, right? And speaks, and as I mentioned, Zilkova, now Zilkova has also voted for Batulak in 2017. So this is not MPP stalwarts. This is not people who, without considering anything, always vote the same party. And so there's some interesting things going on, I think, even in the countryside, which we tend to portray as this kind of monolith of people for 30 years voting the same party and not moving around a whole lot. A final note, maybe, I mean, one of the things that's interesting that's coming up that a Twitter follower pointed out to me, of course, we've got two by-elections coming, right? Because obviously Hohenzog's seat in Henty is up, and Tumia I didn't realize that when you become governor of Ulaanbaatar, you have to give up your parliamentary seat. And so we've got an election coming up in Zilkova district, which is where Enkhtsetseg did very well. And so interesting how that will play out in the bigger question of, was this whole situation a boost to Hun as a party and as a political movement? And will we see very active campaigning, I'm sure, in Zilkova, but will they have a shot at placing perhaps a second MP. Henty maybe a little less interesting. I mean, it's been fairly conservative in I don't mean conservative in a political sense, but in voting over and over for the MPP. And so one would imagine Hubertus's chances to, you know, he'll pick a successor of some kind who might have a good shot at a seat, but not necessarily in Suchpater, and so that'll be quite interesting. I'll leave it at that. We are a small number, as I mentioned. The raise hand function works well because it puts you in an order automatically. I know a number of you have put some comments into the questions, into the chat, and some questions. So I would encourage you to raise your hand and give us your question again, or offer your observations. Doesn't all have to be questions. Many of you know a whole lot about this and may have been in Ulaanbaatar at the time and want to contribute as well. Anand came in first in the hand raising race. Go ahead, Anand.
Yeah, I actually tried to check it in the chat. To me, there was in this election, Bayan-Hongara province was always been a Democratic Party stronghold. It mainly voted for DP for consecutive years. It even won seats. I think it secured seats in the last parliamentary election, and this time around, the numbers were just not there. It was abysmal for the Democratic Party, and that was quite surprising to me. As to me, I think the Democratic Party in that region did not seem to been organized, or I don't know what happened, and maybe it was the faction of Batolga that didn't want to give any more strength to Irten, and those kind of things seem to spoke up. And maybe one person told me that Batolga's team actually worked with the Hursuk team in Bayan-Hongara to not let Irten get any votes. And I don't know if I can't verify this of any accounts, but to me, the Democratic Party losing that province was very surprising, to say the least. Yeah.
Mark, we emailed a couple months ago. You were still unable to go back to Mongolia. Are you back in Mongolia now?
I was, and I just got back to Japan today.
Okay, fresh off the plane in Japan. So yeah. What did you think? What did you want to comment on?
I think, you know, the turnout to me actually was higher than I expected. And essentially you had the two of the three parties with the largest turnout machines deciding to turn them off. MPRP merged and more or less advocated for Hursuk, but didn't actively invest like they would have in previous elections. And obviously the DP consciously decided, a large portion of them, not to turn on that turnout machine, right? And the lack of effort from two of the three parties that have, I mean, Hun outperformed their party infrastructure, right? On the base of the candidate. They don't have much of a turnout machine. And so you really only had one of the three largest organized structures actively working to turn people out. It's not to say that there wasn't some effort, but you had, I agree with Anand that the president's people were either non-aligned or quietly more likely to be aligned with the former prime minister. And you had Erdogan's people, some of them supporting him, but quietly saying, we need to burn this thing down to the ground to rebuild it, right? And kind of tacitly accepting that logic. And so given that, a 60% turnout is not quite as bad as you could have anticipated even. And I know there was a lot of fear within those organizing the elections that they wouldn't hit 50% turnout this time around due to COVID and everything else. And they were quite actively discouraging talking about protest ballots, blank ballots in a way that they weren't before. So I think the turnout in many ways isn't that surprising. And I think the result, again, you had last year in 2017, an election dominated by two personalities that were not in the mainstream. Well, they were mainstream, but they weren't traditional in terms of the current president as well as Gambatar. And so those voters were not likely to transfer back to their own parties in any stretch. And in many ways, the type of person who likes the current president's leadership style would more likely be drawn to Mr. Hurlsuk than Mr. Enkbot in terms of the style, the presentation, which does remain quite important. I think the depth of the DP collapse is the main surprise from this election, and that again, if you were talking to people, was something that some in the party saw coming and actively were working towards it to some extent. The long-term implication, I also would point out that I think there isn't a desire to give MPP as much credit perhaps as they deserve. And I directly observed Mr. Hurlsuk's campaign having more resources to invest in these kind of things, but investing more in promoting outreach to young urban voters. And I think if you said, where did he overperform our expectations, perhaps the fact that he won every district of UB, might have been seen as slightly surprising, both for that bubble effect that you mentioned, Julian, but also what we think of as the average Hurlsuk voter didn't prove to be quite right. He actually attracted more young people, I think, than many people expected. And they really worked at that. And if you talk about who are the most well-known young political leaders, partially because MPP dominates in so many positions, but from Oyen Erden down, they certainly have done the most to bring in new faces. Now, whether that means real change within the party is yet to be seen. But I think we also should give them credit. And part of it is because you have all the infrastructure, you have the resources right now, they actually can invest in that evolution of the party. And they ran a campaign that was more modern than they've run in the past. And finally, I'd point out that Mr. Hurlsuk the comparisons to 2017 don't work because he's just a far superior candidate. He's considered very charming, very smooth, very personable. He has a really good way with people, and he's very sharp, careful with his media image, as I think Anand mentioned. They control every little element of it. And even there is speculation he wouldn't agree to a debate just to control it. And my last point is, I think we need to really think about the structural issues here, and the structure of campaigns. The short campaign season seems to be again and again a huge disadvantage for anyone who doesn't start with really big name recognition, especially outside of UB, like Mr. Enkbot suffered from. And the fact that I think the main conclusion from the elections observation was this tradition, and it's not unique to this cycle, of all the government decisions and visits and infrastructure announcements that seem to happen during the campaign. And the fact that we do have an active effort to influence the results through the actions of government, which isn't supposed to be the case. It's hard to avoid. And again, I'm not saying it was worse this time than in the past, but it's part of the political culture that does seem to play to, I think, what Anand was mentioning, these voters who are looking for social policy improvements and direct benefits. Clearly, it's a bit one-sided who can offer those. And I think in some of the Elbigdorj elections, you saw the same thing happen. So there's some real structural issues that I think are ripe for debate. We're done with this election cycle. And for me, this campaign season and this process that doesn't allow even the big DP fight to be resolved in time for the campaign would be really ripe issues for discussion. Thanks for organizing today. It's great to connect with everybody.
Yeah, thanks for contributing, Marcus. Great. Before we jump into the fate of the DP, which is exercising lots of people, I think, the turnout machines you talked about, Mark, one of the things that struck me when I looked at the turnout by IMAC yesterday, and I didn't go back to the previous elections to double check, but this time Ulaanbaatar voted at significantly higher rates than the countryside. And my recollection, at least, is that that was reversed from what had happened before. And particularly considering these issues around re-registration, right, of migrants coming into the city, or even students or so, that puzzles me, right? Because it tells me that people in Ulaanbaatar were engaged, but that also the sense that the choices were, there was more of a choice to make this time, actually, right? The big frustration in 2017 that led to the blank ballot, I think, was, well, none of these people are attractive, right? In part because M and Batudak were not particularly attractive as candidates, and Gambatar was a protest. But, and so you think the turnout machines then failed, particularly in the countryside, which is where their strength probably lies, because that's where the party organizational strength is, right?
Oh, absolutely, I would agree. And the tactics for turning out the vote are very different. In UB, it was interesting. This was the least postered election I've ever seen in UB. I happened upon a couple Horosuks, a few Erdens, but the turnout in the urban center is going all social media now. It's a very different game than it used to be. Whereas in the IMAGs, it's a bit more traditional. It's knocking on doors, events, teas, as Anand was saying, right? And so I think you're seeing a bifurcation of strategies. And again, only a well-structured candidacy that has the ability to have a fairly complex operation is going to be able to react to both. And I think, again, Mr. Hurlsuk benefited from having the most active turnout machine in the IMAGs, as well as a very active social media and very controlled and to be fair, fairly savvy outreach. I mean, the MPP has been able to secure some really high quality people in around the PM and others recently. And I think it showed. And even with a youth outreach, you had a very concerted social media campaign to just make it socially acceptable to support Mr. Hurlsuk that was launched in the last week. You had some funny videos of like cool young people putting on Hurlsuk t-shirts while skateboarding, and some fairly, they bought up some social media influencers that had previously been unaligned, and they made a really concerted effort. So I think it just goes to show that everywhere in the world, the level of sophistication at winning elections as a thing you do is increasing. And I think the MPP has the resource advantage, but they also have put in effort to try and be able to do both in a way that, Mr. Enkhtsetseg was great on social, pretty good on social media. I don't want to overstate it. And that helps more in the cities. Just my opinion from observing it. But I was shocked by how few posters there were around town. It used to be like you'd be a poster on every corner, but there weren't that many. And it shows a clear difference in strategy.
Very interesting, right? Because it's just sort of the atmosphere of an election was so dominated by the visual presence in the past, and so if that's no longer the case, fascinating. I'm a little disappointed that once again no one has offered to bribe me if they're buying social influencers. Must grow my Twitter following so that I can break into that market. A little bit offended actually, but we'll leave that at that. Let's get into that DP topic because a whole bunch of people have posted already. Just because it came up, I've just kind of made a quick poll. This is not good scientific practice because I've just invented it on the fly. But see if you want to respond to this to give us a little bit of a sense of what the fate of the DP is. But who wants to say a little bit about the DP and your expectations? I know some people posted early in the chat. Does someone want to speak about that specifically? Anand, what do you think?
I think it's going to splinter off. The party is going to splinter off into two. Ethan should have given off his spot and made way for other members that were more viable. And I think I was talking with a few DP people, and they say the people who voted for Ethan are probably the only members of the DP that said forget it, I'm part of this party, I'm just gonna vote for the party, and that's it. And most of the other people might have shifted, and as you can see that the splintered fraction of the talk together, like giving statements saying how it was a bad candidate, it just provokes the party into more disarray. It just splinters the party. And yeah, I was talking about Bayern Hongora, and even in 2016, even if Battle lost, he didn't lost. He lost with significantly less, and also to Shumbai, there were some margins, but this time they were basically demolished. And I think at this moment the DP, I don't know, I don't know how they will get back up on their feet. It's very unlikely. And from my perspective, I can see that the DP should have invested more in younger voters, like younger talent from their party. Like in 2020, I saw a lot of more young, influential, or like more young, how can I say, like members from the Mongolian People Party that come up to the parliamentary election, and then DP did not seem to be eager on like investing in more younger, like youthful energy of leadership into their party. And I think those kind of things really hurt them, that they were stuck in their old ways of saying like, we are the revolution, we stomped off this like the tyranny of the Mongolian People's Party. And I think people got sick of that, and the old guards of the party are still saying those things, and they cannot see that things have changed. People have different perspectives on the world now, that they don't care about the revolution or anything. They just want consistency and more of a stable working government rather than like infighting. Yeah.
Interesting, Anand. So unfortunately, my turnout is worse than the presidential election significantly. Must be my unscientific polling methods. And we don't have a decisive result here. We've got a 4-2 of those 6 of you who wanted to say. 4 of you support what Anand was just saying, that it'll just mostly splinter and maybe go disappear after that. Oh, wait a second. I didn't share. Now you actually get to see it yourself.
Can I say something to
Please, Enkhe. Yeah, jump in.
Because I'm from Biohunger, and just before the election, my mom was on the phone with me. She's 70 years old, right? Just to make sure that she wanted to vote for Inkpat, but she wanted to make sure that Inkpat is not Elbegdor's person. If you remember, there was an online video circulating where it kind of alluded to the fact that Inkpat is someone like a puppet of Elbegdor. And Elbegdor has very bad reputation in Biohunger because he was once, representing Biohunger, but he didn't do actually much for Biohunger. So that's why. And Batullah has a lot of support in Biohunger. He's the NATO son, and he's been elected from Biohunger, especially from my mom's home several times. He invested a lot in there, etc., etc. So that actually believed. And a lot of people in Biohunger were just not very happy about this, like what's happening within DP. That's why, it really lost a lot of votes. A lot of people voted with blank ballots in Biohunger as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Toby, did you want to
And
go ahead, Enkhe? Yeah.
Your second observation about the DP not being able to, promote younger people. That has to do with the finance, and it also came out during this election as well. Their accounts were frozen in the middle of campaign, which never happened before, right? It turned out they owed a lot of money. So if you looked at, like we talked about it in the last conference, I mentioned about the overdue payment that DP has from the last election, which was almost like 2 billion. Maybe it's more because it's on, this number is what showed up in official reports, right? But we don't know how big the actual sum is, but the rumor has it that they owe a lot of money from last parliamentary election. And the reason why they can't actually field like strong young candidates is that they have to raise money to fund their electoral campaign. And the only way it seems for the DP is to actually, recruit really wealthy candidates who can fund their campaigns as well as their party from their pockets. So not many young people can do that, unfortunately. So that's why the pledge money and all that stuff that comes into play, which really messes up the candidates.
Enkhe, Mark was just talking about the demise of the poster and the shift to a social media campaign. Is that not cheaper? And would that not open opportunities, at least in 2024 in a parliamentary election, for candidates to come forward with less money up front?
Digital campaign is not necessarily cheaper. Yeah,
because you need to hire staff who run it well, and they may just be more expensive than the posters would have been?
Well, the troll army, we're talking about troll army a lot in this election. And, you know, there are also some technical issues that I can't quite understand, like in Google search, for instance, you have to, you know, pay a certain amount of money so that your candidate shows up in Google search, et cetera, et cetera. So there are those things as well, and sponsored ads and whatnot. But our monitoring actually showed Dierkes had a lot of coverage on Facebook, for instance, like mostly volunteer staff that he supports were like making posters, etc. And he was endorsed by quite a few individuals who have, you know, good visibility on social platforms, etc. So that might have actually contributed to his, you know, support. The fact that he received a lot of support in urban areas as well.
Right. Toby, you've been patient. You want to jump in here?
I was going to, yeah, hi. Hi, everybody, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak. And, you know, I've been very interested to hear what people had to say, and, you know, some of the chat comments have been quite interesting as well. Yeah, I mean, the Democratic Party, they seem to be still fighting the old, I mean, I've made the comment, they seem to be still fighting the old battles of about 20 odd years ago, and they seem to have got stuck in a bit of a time warp. And I think that, you know, the inability of the old guard to sort of promote younger talent is an issue, because actually, you know, money could be put behind younger candidates if the Democratic Party chose to do so. It doesn't need necessarily, you know, older, more established candidates funding their own campaigns for that. They could have used donor money in a much more effective way and brought through younger talent. But as I say, they seem to have been so obsessed with fighting the battles of the 90s still for some reason. And I think also that, you know, Marissa and I have had conversations about the Democratic Party, you know, behind the scenes. You know, they're a bunch of individuals at the end of the day. There seems to be very little, you know, very little effort towards cohesion. And I think that this was a disaster waiting to happen. You know, this big split between Erdogan and, you know, I totally agree with, I think it was Anand's comment, you know, that he did not put the interests of the country and the interests of his party above his own ego. You know, he lost last year. He had Bayangol. I understand from, you know, my wife and other people that Bayangol has been very much Erdogan's sort of fiefdom, and he even managed to lose that in the parliamentary election. Now, when you lose your fiefdom in a parliamentary election, that's normally a good sign that it's time for you to leave the stage. And it seemed that he was really unable to just let go and allow the party to move forward without him. And this was a major issue. He also seriously, the way in which the internal election process inside the Democratic Party was organized was a massive disaster. I mean, Owen Garrel was so offended by the way in which she was treated that she decided to walk off, threw her toys. I mean, I'm going to be a little bit unkind here, threw her toys out of the pram, walked off, and has sort of more or less gone off and already started the process of forming her own political movement. Now, she's kind of recognized that there's a need to promote younger talent, but of course she wants to lead that promotion of younger talent. So maybe she's looking towards a run herself for the, you know, get some people elected in 2024 and then put herself forward again to become maybe the first female president of the country. I mean, there's all sorts of very interesting undercurrents. But there's also something very interesting in Mongolia. There's a catch-up going on at last in terms of, you know, Enkhtsetseg was very savvy in the way in which he used social media, and that struck me immediately. But unfortunately, Hun is still very much organizationally behind the other parties. They've got a lot of work to do. I think they can use this by-election here. I'm sitting at the moment, I live in Sukhbata, into Sukhbata district in Ulaanbaatar. They could use the by-election to, you know, to build their presence in parliament. But I think also they'll need to work towards building their presence on local government as well, both within Ulaanbaatar. At the moment, I understand they have three councillors on the Ulaanbaatar City Council, and you commented that Julian, that you expected them to do a lot better than that, given the smaller party. I think Hun can grow. Engbak can help them to grow. He's given them more profile now. He can help them to grow, but they'll need to perhaps have a local government first strategy and to target in by-elections. And this is the sort of thing that third-party insurgents in other countries where there are two very established parties have been very successful in building their profile. We can see this in the United States. We can see this in the United Kingdom, and even in other more recent democracies which are of similar age to Mongolia, like for instance Croatia. We've seen the emergence of insurgent parties by having a local government first strategy and then building that into success at the parliamentary level, to then use that to push where there are presidential elections, to push for your profile nationally, and to maybe have a shot at winning the presidency. So I think Hun have come out very strongly from this election. They will have a lot of work to do, and they'll need to build an infrastructure which they don't have at this point in time. But I think they have potential. For the Democratic Party, I think they're going to have a lot of bloodletting over the next year or two before the next parliamentary elections, and they've got to really sort themselves out. And my personal view is, I don't think they'll survive in their current format. I think that they will. There is a need for a centre-right political party in Mongolia to represent, the free markets, soft conservatism, if you like, a bit like, say, the CDU. So something like a hybrid between the CDU and the Free Democratic Party in Germany, for example. I think there's a need for that kind of party to represent the centre-right in politics. But unfortunately, I think the personalities are a major problem inside the Democratic Party, and I think it's going to be a horrible 2 years for centre-right politics in Mongolia. I think there's going to be a lot of bloodletting, a lot of arguing, a lot of shouting, and then maybe something may emerge from the wreckage in time for the next parliamentary election, but possibly not. And I think that maybe something will emerge, maybe for the presidential election. Maybe they'll get one seat, use that for a presidential election run. Maybe, the parliamentary election after that, maybe something from the wreckage of the Democratic Party may sort of come back to life. So they're kind of my observations, if you like.
The long-term outlook, right? We'll see. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Should we turn? We're planning for an hour and a half. We've got a couple of minutes left here. Should we turn a little bit towards an outlook of President Horizok? What kind of president is he going to be? Does anyone have a sense? What are you expecting?
Can I just throw in a dissenting voice? I think, in a way, that there might have been some people in the young guard, the young Turks, as I call them, of the MPP, who might have secretly hoped that he would have got beaten, and then he might have gone off the stage, and they might have then been given more of a free hand. I think that maybe the Prime Minister would have liked to have a bit more of a free hand to modernise the government, and I feel that he might actually be a bit of a brake on that process. I'm just going to throw that in and then hopefully start a nice big row or a nice big debate on that.
Just to respond to that, yesterday, the press representative of the government actually spoke about dropping some of the welfare measures to help people during the pandemic. And his suggestion was to, have a meeting of the National Security Council, which is headed by the president, to discuss these measures. And everybody's reaction on Twitter is like, what does National Security Council have anything to do with these measures that the government, has full power to decide on? So if that's any indication what his presidency might look like, we're actually worried. I'm worried.
Interesting, yeah. Other views on the future of a Horizok presidency? with an MPP government obviously in place. Uyan for now. Anand, go ahead.
Yeah, one person pointed this to me that we all know that the MPP and the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party came together and became one party again. And that person pointed out that this happened because the former president Enkhtsetseg, if you go on his website, in his party website, you will see what was it? A new constitutional amendment, and in that it was stating how the president should have all the powers and to control everything. And his worry was that that might actually happen, and that was the agreement between Enkhtsetseg and Hulusu, that Hulusu would probably use his powers and adopt that amendment that the Mongolian Revolutionary Party proposed. If you go on the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, I think you will find that, and that might be quite alarming if that's true, though. Like if Hulusu sees, okay, that Enkhtsetseg would want to have one presidency that actually rules everything, and he told and Hulusu probably said, I'll adopt your new amendments and we can have an agreement or something. Yeah.
Go ahead, Jana.
So, in my opinion, soon the celebrations will finish, and the country needs to realistically face the situation, especially related to the COVID-19, different loans, different grants that they have received. There are many gaps that need to be really filled out, many loans that need to be paid back, and in my opinion, the role of the new president will be to explain to the people why there will be strict measures in the place very soon. So in my opinion, in the next maybe 2 to 3 years, he will be the main person leading and explaining people why the government needs to cut also different social benefits.
All right, that was a specific prediction. Fantastic. Other views on what a Hulusu presidency might look like?
By the look of it, Julian, the discussion that I had, it's going to be a very anti-foreign miners in the country, maybe anti-Western foreign miners, probably. The Dubai Agreement getting repealed is going to send out a signal, definitely. But I'm wondering how the economy is going to, what we're going to do. It's already in a very bad shape already, right? So it's gonna have a, like, economically, I think Mongolia is gonna go through a rough time. I wonder who of the neighbors gonna extend a loan.
I don't know. So I think I see this a little bit differently. Hulusu has not involved himself in OT very much in parliament or as prime minister, right? He has not been a loud voice on this. He really hasn't pushed. As far as I can tell, he doesn't have to seem much interest in this issue at all. And so I kind of see the push, the Mahnam now coming in, the MPRP, and making demands on the MPP for supporting him and all that, yeah. But much of that lies with the government, with the prime minister, not with the president. And I don't really see Hulusu particularly sticking his neck out on an issue like this and becoming sort of a voice for the government on OT. But I'm curious, just in terms of as a political personality, that hasn't been what he's done, right? He's never sort of picked up specific issues that he's really pushed. I don't think I can identify a single sort of policy that I said, oh, wow, that was a Hulusu idea and he made that happen, in the way that for some other people, there are such policies. And so I see the potential, but Hulusu himself as president, I don't see particularly involved in that. Am I wrong?
I went to his rally and he did he mentioned Oyu Tolgoi and Rio Tinto a lot in his rally speeches. He talked specifically how, as his last meeting as prime minister, he spoke with the heads of Rio and demanded that they have a favorable agreement towards the Mongolians. And it was thanks to his government that the people received the 300,000 Turks during the lockdown in April. And he assured that the people that the OT agreement will be favorable towards to Mongolians and not to foreigners.
Right, so he's picking up on this rhetoric, and that makes you think maybe he would be more pushy in that regard, given the position of, you know, he's got sort of a pulpit to speak from as president, right? And that's your guess then?
Yes, yes.
Other topics? I know, Bulgan, you've been following the chat questions well. Are the earlier questions that we left unanswered that we should come back to in your mind?
Yes, actually, 2 questions I reposted, and Bim Zhao is right here, so we can ask his question. Also, I have a question for everyone from Hishi. Yeah, Hishi. Bim Zhao's question was on the I think could you ask Bim Zhao, or do I'll just look it up real quick. Just give me a moment, please. Okay, so how crucial was the NPP's move to stop Gambatar and Oyungeril and other more competent contenders from DP to run against Hurulsuk? Crucial for the results.
Can I say? I mean, I'm puzzled by this. You know, this is a sort of kind of conspiracy theory that somehow the MPP was really interfering in the internal party affairs of the Democratic Party. I mean, the only time at which they had any real influence was in the decision maybe of which of the 2 Democratic Party candidates was actually allowed legally to run. But this is kind of, where does this come from? I'm puzzled by this, because I'm absolutely certain that the Democratic Party would never have allowed the Mongolian People's Party to sort of somehow filter the choices of the Democratic Party. I mean, that's what the Democratic Party is all about, resisting the MPP. So where does that view come from? I'm really puzzled by this. When I saw this, I was astonished, to be honest.
Someone want to speak to where the story sort of emerged from?
I think it emerges from internally from the Democratic Party members. I spoke with few members, and they all, like only 2, I would say, and both of them said that Irtin was bought off by Hurulsuk, but I cannot fact check this. And they said that he had a sham internal election, and I think that might have some grain of salt, because as we all know that Girift, the political what do you call him?
Political scientist?
Yes, political scientist. He always talks about how parties don't have internal democracy. Everything is not internally a democratic process. Things are done mostly by the people who are powerful inside the parties, and who probably has the more money inside the parties. And there's probably been exchange of monies between the candidates, but I cannot verify this. But I do have 2 sources that do say that Irtin was bought off by Yusuf to run in this election.
And unsurprisingly, after 90 minutes in a discussion on Mongolian politics, we end up with that financial conspiracy. It's usually where we start, and we're in the middle, and in the end, we end up there as well. I'm a strong and committed disbeliever in all these conspiracy theories, and thus I want to ban the word puppet. But that may just be my personal crusade. I want to thank my fellow panelists for joining. I want to thank also Jana had the initiative and said, hey, let's have a discussion. And we pulled it all together very quickly. I want to thank you, audience, for being responsive and somehow catching wind of the event and joining us for the discussion. I think we all maintain our interests, and there's an urge to discuss sometimes, and this was a good forum for that. So thank you very much again. Do follow us, do follow our blog, do follow some of our colleagues on Twitter, and discussions will continue. And I wish you all a good evening if you're on the West Coast, and a good day in Mongolia, and a nice weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye.
Shabbat shalom.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you all.